A cold gust of wind swept through the darkened streets of Manhattan as Kathleen McCormack Durst walked through the door of her apartment. The lights flickered faintly, casting long shadows along the walls. The date was January 31st, 1982, the last night anyone would ever see her alive. Earlier that evening, Kathleen had argued with her husband Robert Durst at their South Salem cottage. The tension had been brewing for months, if not years. Her once charming husband had become unpredictable, controlling, dangerous. She had confided in friends, told them she feared for her life. "If anything happens to me, check Robert," she had whispered over the phone to a close friend just days prior. But no one had imagined that night would be her last. Robert's version of events was shaky at best. He claimed he had dropped Kathleen off at the train station so she could return to their Manhattan apartment. But something was off. There were no confirmed sightings of her on the train. No one saw her step foot inside her apartment. The only thing that remained was an eerie silence, a missing woman, and a husband who seemed disturbingly calm about it all. The first red flag came the following morning. Kathleen, a dedicated student at Albert Einstein College of Medicine, failed to show up for class. Her professors were immediately concerned. She had never missed a day. A call was placed to her husband. Robert answered, unfazed. "She's probably at the apartment or with friends," he told them casually. But he didn't check. He didn't seem to care. Later that afternoon, the dean of Kathleen's school received a call from someone claiming to be Kathleen herself. The voice sounded strange, almost forced. The caller stated that Kathleen was feeling sick and wouldn't be attending class, but the dean knew something wasn't right. The voice lacked warmth. The cadence was off. It didn't sound like Kathleen at all. Her friends were growing restless. Kathleen had told them about the bruises, the fights, the fear that gripped her every time she was alone with Robert. She wanted out, but Robert wouldn't let her go. That night, one of her closest friends made the call to police, but what happened next would set the tone for the next 4 decades. The case was dismissed as a missing persons report. No urgency, no crime scene, no immediate search. After all, she was just a woman who had an argument with her husband. Women left their marriages all the time, right? Robert played the role of the concerned husband well, at least at first. He told police he had spoken to Kathleen over the phone after she arrived at their apartment. He painted a picture of a wife who had been stressed, overworked, someone who might have run away. But the details didn't add up. Neighbors never heard Kathleen return that night. The doorman never saw her. The apartment remained untouched, as if no one had been there at all. And then, the searches began. Kathleen's family refused to accept the simple narrative that she had left voluntarily. They pushed the police to investigate further. They combed through Robert's statements, his timelines, his alibis. But there was no body, no proof of foul play. And without that, there was no case. Robert, unfazed by the suspicions, carried on with his life. Within days, he was back to business as usual, walking the streets of New York as though nothing had happened. But behind closed doors, a storm was brewing, and Kathleen, she had vanished into thin air. In the beginning, Robert Durst was charming. He was a wealthy heir, a man of privilege, someone who moved effortlessly through Manhattan's elite social circles. And Kathleen McCormack? She was young, bright, full of life. The kind of woman who lit up a room the moment she stepped in. To outsiders, they seemed like the perfect couple. But behind closed doors, their marriage was built on something far darker. Kathleen had grown up in a working-class family, a stark contrast to Robert's world of wealth and excess. She was ambitious, putting herself through medical school, determined to build a future of her own. But Robert didn't want an independent wife. He wanted control. The first signs of trouble came early. Small things. The way he corrected her in public, the way his temper flared when things didn't go his way. Kathleen brushed it off at first, convincing herself that every marriage had struggles. But over time, the cracks widened. The arguments became more frequent, the tension unbearable. Kathleen confided in friends, whispered about the bruises she covered with makeup, the late-night fights, the fear that tightened around her like a vice. Then came the incident in their penthouse apartment. A neighbor later recalled hearing screams, glass breaking. The next morning, Kathleen showed up at work with a swollen lip. She waved off concerns. "It's nothing," she had said, but it was never nothing. By late 1981, Kathleen was ready to leave. She had been speaking to a divorce attorney, gathering evidence, Bank statements, property records, anything that would ensure she got what she deserved. She knew leaving Robert wouldn't be easy, but she never got the chance. Just weeks before she disappeared, something changed. Kathleen became jumpy, nervous. She started telling people she was afraid Robert would kill her. If something happens to me, don't let them believe it was an accident. Then, January 31st, 1982. Their South Salem cottage stood in eerie silence that night. What really happened inside those walls remains a mystery. Robert claimed they argued, that Kathleen left for Manhattan. But there were no witnesses, no confirmed sightings, just Robert's word. Days after her disappearance, while police dismissed it as a simple missing person case, Robert made an unsettling move. He went back to their apartment, but not to look for her, to get rid of her belongings. Kathleen's possessions, her textbooks, her clothes, her medical notes, began vanishing, piece by piece, as if she had never existed. And when her worried family and friends pushed for answers, Robert had just one response. She's probably off somewhere, having fun. But nobody was buying it. January 31st, 1982. A cold, bitter night in South Salem. The wind howled through the trees surrounding the Durst cottage, the bare branches clawing against the windows like skeletal fingers. Inside, the tension was suffocating. Kathleen McCormack Durst stood in the dimly lit living room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She had made up her mind. She was leaving. But Robert Durst wasn't the kind of man to be left. Their voices clashed, breaking the silence of the secluded home. "You're not going anywhere." Robert's voice was low, dangerous. Kathleen took a shaky breath, her pulse racing. "I'm done, Robert. I can't do this anymore." A glass shattered. A door slammed. Neighbors later recalled hearing raised voices, muffled shouts. But no one called the police. Not that night. Not ever. And then, silence. Hours later, Robert would tell the world that he had dropped Kathleen off at the Katona train station, sending her back to Manhattan, that she had been alive and well, stepping into the night alone. But no one saw her at the station. No conductor remembered her boarding the train. And when she supposedly arrived at their Manhattan apartment, no one saw her there either. Robert claimed they had spoken over the phone later that night. He said she sounded just fine, but something wasn't right. The following morning, when Kathleen failed to show up for her clinical rotations at Albert Einstein College of Medicine, red flags should have been raised. But the first real sign of deception came when the school received a call from someone claiming to be Kathleen. "I'm sick," the voice on the other end said flatly. "I won't be coming in today." It should have ended the concern, but something about it felt off. The cadence, the pitch. It didn't sound like Kathleen. Later, investigators would suspect the call was made by Susan Burman, Robert's most loyal friend, the woman who would die nearly 2 decades later, taking her secrets to the grave. Meanwhile, back at the Durst apartment, something unsettling was happening. Kathleen's belongings were disappearing, her textbooks, her notes, as if someone was erasing her existence. Robert, he wasn't frantic. He wasn't grieving. He went about his business as if nothing had happened. When Kathleen's family and friends grew desperate, calling him repeatedly, his responses were cold, calculated. "She's off somewhere, having fun," he said dismissively. The police, they weren't concerned. "She's an adult," they told her family. "If she wants to disappear for a while, she can..." No search party, no urgency. Kathleen McCormack Durst had vanished, and no one, not her family, not her friends, could shake the feeling that Robert Durst had something to do with it. The ringing phone shattered the early morning silence. It was February 1st, 1982. In the administrative office of Albert Einstein College of Medicine, a receptionist reached for the receiver. The voice on the other end was calm, almost detached. "I'm sick," the caller said flatly. "I won't be coming in today." There was a pause. "Kathleen?" "Yes." Click. The line went dead. But something about that call felt wrong. The voice lacked warmth. It was rushed, clipped, and distant. Not the voice of a woman who had been dedicated to her studies, who had never missed a class without a valid reason. That call was the moment everything changed. Kathleen's friends had already begun panicking. She hadn't returned their calls. She hadn't shown up for classes. It wasn't like her. They tried calling Robert Durst, demanding answers. "She's probably out partying," he told them. "She does this sometimes." But they knew better. Kathleen wasn't reckless. She wasn't someone who would just walk away from everything she had worked for. That afternoon, a group of her friends drove to her apartment. The moment they stepped inside, their stomachs sank. Everything looked too perfect, too staged. Her belongings were still there, her purse, her books, but something was missing. There were no signs that she had been there since Sunday night. Robert arrived later, seemingly unbothered. He barely glanced at them before tossing his coat onto a chair. "She probably ran off," he said. One of Kathleen's friends, furious, stepped forward. "Ran off where, Robert? She was scared of you." Robert's expression didn't change. If anything, he looked amused. "Then she had a reason to leave, didn't she?" That was the moment they knew. Something terrible had happened. As the hours passed, the phone call to the medical school gnawed at them. One of Kathleen's closest friends, Gilberte Najami, decided to call the school herself. When the receptionist repeated the details of the call, chills ran down her spine. "It wasn't Kathy," she said. "That wasn't her voice." But if Kathleen hadn't made that call, who did? As the reality of that question settled in, the search for Kathleen was no longer just about a missing woman. It was about a crime that had already been committed. The moment Kathleen McCormack Durst vanished, Robert Durst began spinning a web of deception, one so intricate that it would take decades to unravel. At first, his lies were subtle, small inconsistencies in his story, minor details that didn't quite add up. But as days passed, those inconsistencies grew into glaring contradictions. Robert claimed he had dropped Kathleen off at the train station in Katona that Sunday night. No one saw her there. He said he had spoken to her later that night when she reached their Manhattan apartment. The doorman never saw her arrive. Then, there was the phone call to the medical school, the one that was supposed to be from Kathleen. But her voice was off. And when friends pressed Robert about it, his reaction was unsettling. "Why does it matter?" he said with a shrug. Kathleen's family wasn't buying any of it. They knew she hadn't just disappeared, and the more they pushed, the more erratic Robert's behavior became. Days after Kathleen's disappearance, Robert seemed unaffected. He didn't call her family. He didn't help search for her. Instead, he started removing traces of her existence. He went back to their Manhattan apartment, cleaned it out, her belongings gone, her textbooks, her personal notes, even her mail, as if she had never lived there at all. Then, something even stranger happened. One of Kathleen's friends received a call from Susan Burman, Robert's closest confidant. Susan's voice was calm, steady. "Robert is going through a lot right now," she said. "He just needs space." It was odd. Susan wasn't just a friend. She was fiercely loyal to Robert, almost protective of him, and for some reason she seemed to be handling his alibi. As the pressure mounted, Robert's story kept shifting. First, he said Kathleen was stressed, that she might have left to clear her head. Then he suggested that maybe she was using drugs and had run off. But when that didn't stick, his version of events changed yet again. Maybe she had an accident. Maybe someone else took her. Maybe. But there was one version of events Robert never considered, that Kathleen was dead, and that he was responsible. Susan Burman had always been loyal to Robert Durst. She understood him in ways no one else could. Maybe it was their shared past, both children of privilege, both raised in families where secrets were currency. But Susan wasn't just a friend. She was his confidant, his protector, and she knew things, too many things. After Kathleen disappeared, Susan became Robert's shield. While the world whispered about his possible involvement, she defended him without hesitation. She reassured his friends, handled calls from the police, and perhaps most chillingly, may have been the one who placed the phone call to Kathleen's medical school, posing as her. It was a role she played effortlessly. She was the daughter of a mobster, after all. She knew how to cover tracks. But what Susan didn't realize was that knowing too much about Robert Durst came with a price. Years passed. The world moved on. Robert slipped further into his isolated, eccentric life, avoiding the spotlight while still managing to evade justice. But then, in 2000, something happened. The case of Kathleen McCormack Durst was reopened. Investigators were beginning to connect the dots. Old witnesses came forward. New forensic techniques were applied, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, the walls were closing in on Robert Durst. Then, a phone call. It was Susan. She was worried. The police wanted to speak with her. She had protected Robert for years, but now she was having doubts. Would she talk? No one knows exactly what Susan told Robert during their final conversation, but what is known is that within days, she was dead. Shot execution style in her Los Angeles home. The killer? No forced entry, no sign of a struggle. It was as if she had opened the door for someone she trusted, someone like Robert. Shortly after Susan's body was discovered, an anonymous letter was sent to police. One word scrawled on the envelope: cadaver. Inside, an address, Susan's address. For years it remained a mystery. Who sent it? Who knew about the body before anyone else did? Decades later, handwriting experts would compare that note to letters written by Robert Durst himself. And the results? A match. December 23, 2000. The quiet of the Beverly Hills neighborhood was shattered by a gunshot. Inside her small, cozy home, Susan Burman lay lifeless on the floor, a single bullet wound to the back of her head. Execution style. No forced entry. No sign of struggle. She had trusted her killer. Neighbors heard nothing. No screams, no disturbance, just silence. But then, an envelope arrived at the Beverly Hills Police Department. On it, a single word misspelled in block letters: cadaver. Inside, an address, Susan's address. It was as if the killer wanted her body to be found, but only after he was long gone. In the days leading up to her murder, Susan had been anxious. She had confided in friends that investigators were reaching out to her about Kathleen McCormack Durst's disappearance. She had always defended Robert, always stood by him. But now she wasn't sure. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was fear. Maybe she had decided that it was time to talk, and Robert Durst couldn't let that happen. When police arrived at Susan's house, they found no signs of a break-in. Her front door was locked. The house was undisturbed. Her purse, her phone, her personal belongings, nothing was taken. This wasn't a robbery. This was an execution. They found her lying near the Christmas tree, presents still neatly wrapped beneath it. She had been killed just days before the holidays, before she could sit down with investigators and tell them what she knew. The timing was too perfect. It didn't take long for detectives to connect the murder back to Robert Durst. They learned that Robert had been in California that very week. They learned that Susan had received a call from him shortly before she was killed. And then, they learned about the cadaver note. The letter was simple, just a few words, but it was the handwriting that caught their attention. It looked identical to Robert Durst's. They weren't the only ones who noticed. Years later, when HBO's The Jinx would analyze the note, Robert himself would react in a way no one expected. But in 2000, there wasn't enough to arrest him. Robert left Los Angeles. He disappeared, just as he always did. Robert Durst had spent decades evading justice. He had slipped through the cracks of the legal system, dodged suspicions, and manipulated those around him. But after Susan Burman's murder in 2000, the pressure was building. Investigators were getting closer. So he did what he had always done best. He disappeared. In 2001, while law enforcement was still trying to connect the dots between Kathleen's disappearance and Susan's execution, Robert Durst was already plotting his next move. This time, he wouldn't rely on his wealth or his last name. This time, he would become someone else. Durst fled to Galveston, Texas, a quiet, unassuming town where no one would recognize him. And to ensure that no one would, he reinvented himself. He shaved his head, hunched his posture, and adopted an entirely new persona, Dorothy Sinner, a mute woman living alone in a rundown apartment far removed from the elite circles of New York and Los Angeles. For months, he lived this way, silent, invisible, a fugitive hiding in plain sight. But even in disguise, trouble followed him. In his Texas hideout, Durst befriended Morris Black, an older man who lived in the same complex. At first, their interactions were uneventful, but then, Morris started asking questions. He noticed the way Dorothy Sinner moved, the odd habits, the way she wasn't as silent as she pretended to be. And one day, he figured it out. Dorothy Sinner wasn't real. She was Robert Durst. And within weeks of Morris Black making that realization, he was dead. On September 30th, 2001, human body parts were found floating in Galveston Bay. A severed torso, limbs detached, a gruesome puzzle with one horrifying truth. Someone had tried to erase a man's existence. When police traced the remains, they led straight back to Robert Durst's apartment. Inside, investigators found something chilling: a saw, garbage bags, and blood. The fugitive's disguise had finally failed him. But even now, caught red-handed, Durst had one more trick up his sleeve. Morris Black had lived a quiet life. A gruff but friendly older man, he didn't ask for much, just a place to sleep and a routine that kept him moving. But in September 2001, he stumbled into something he was never meant to see. A secret, a lie, and a man willing to kill to protect it. At first, Morris and Dorothy Sinner, the mute woman who lived in the next-door apartment, had an odd but harmless relationship. Dorothy was reclusive, barely spoke. Morris, a man who enjoyed conversation, found that frustrating. Why would someone so private move into a place like this? But over time, the little details started to bother him. Dorothy moved strangely for an elderly woman. Her hands were too rough. Her gaze, when she did meet his, was too sharp, too alert. And then there were the moments when he could swear he heard a voice from inside her apartment, a man's voice. It gnawed at him. Then one day, the truth fell into his lap. It wasn't clear how Morris figured it out. Maybe it was a slip in behavior. Maybe it was a careless movement, a gesture too masculine for the woman Robert was pretending to be. But one day, Morris knew. Dorothy Siner wasn't real. She was Robert Durst. Morris, always one to poke the bear, didn't keep his discovery to himself. He confronted Robert about it, maybe as a joke, maybe as a threat. Maybe he thought they had an understanding. But Robert had spent decades escaping the past. He wasn't about to let a nosy neighbor destroy everything. On September 28, 2001, a disturbance rang through the walls of the Galveston apartment complex. Shouts, a struggle, then a gunshot. Morris Black was dead. But Robert's panic didn't come from the fact that he had killed a man. It came from what to do next. The body, the blood, the evidence. So he did what he always did. He cleaned up. He disposed of the body, and he thought he had gotten away with it. Until, days later, pieces of Morris Black's dismembered body began washing ashore in Galveston Bay. Robert Durst had made his first real mistake. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, legal analysts, and members of the public all crammed into the wooden benches, whispering amongst themselves. Everyone wanted to see the man who had eluded justice for decades finally answer for his crimes. But this wasn't a murder trial. Despite the dismembered body parts floating in Galveston Bay, despite the evidence that pointed directly at him, Robert Durst wasn't on trial for murder. He was on trial for tampering with evidence and improper disposal of a body, because somehow his lawyers had found a way to turn the unthinkable into something explainable. When Robert Durst took the stand, no one knew what to expect. His usual demeanor, cold, detached, was replaced by something unexpectedly vulnerable. He admitted to everything. Yes, he had killed Morris Black, but it wasn't murder. It was self-defense, he told the jury, his voice calm, almost soft. He claimed that Morris had become dangerous, erratic, that they had struggled over a gun, that in the chaos, the gun had gone off. And the dismemberment? He didn't deny it. I panicked, he said. I didn't know what to do. He described the scene in graphic, disturbing detail, how he had used a saw to cut up the body, how he had placed each part into plastic bags, weighting them down before dropping them into the bay. The jury sat in stunned silence, not because they didn't believe him, but because his story was working. Robert's defense team didn't try to deny the grotesque facts. Instead, they framed him as a frightened old man who had made a terrible mistake. This is not a killer, his lawyer argued. This is a man who was simply trying to survive. And it worked. The prosecution had all the evidence they needed, but they had no murder weapon, no eyewitnesses, no motive that could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Then, the moment of truth. After just 5 days of deliberation, the jury delivered a verdict that left the courtroom gasping. Not guilty. Robert Durst had admitted to killing a man, dismembering his body, and disposing of the remains. And yet, he walked free. Robert Durst left the courthouse a free man. Once again, he had slipped through the cracks. Once again, he had proven that money, power, and a well-crafted story could bend the justice system to his will. But this time, something was different, because the world had seen what he was capable of, and there were still more bodies to account for. Robert Durst had spent decades evading justice, slipping through the cracks like a ghost. He had walked free after his wife vanished without a trace, after his best friend was executed in her home, and even after a dismembered body was found floating in Galveston Bay. But then, in 2015, the world saw something he never intended for them to hear, a confession. And it was all because of a documentary. For years, journalist and filmmaker Andrew Jarecki had been obsessed with Robert Durst's story. He had already directed All Good Things, a 2010 fictionalized movie based on Kathleen McCormack Durst's disappearance. But he wanted the real story. So when Robert Durst himself reached out to him, offering to participate in a documentary, it was almost too surreal to believe. Why would a man suspected of multiple murders willingly sit down for interviews? Because Robert believed he was untouchable. The documentary, The Jinx, The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst, was unlike anything before it. It didn't just tell his story, it unraveled it. Through old footage, interviews, and shocking new evidence, Jarecki and his team slowly built a case against Durst piece by piece. Then came the cadaver note, a letter sent to police the day Susan Burman was killed, containing only her address and the word cadaver. Handwriting experts compared it to an old letter Robert had written to Susan. It was identical, and when they confronted him with it during the interview, Durst froze. His usual composure cracked for the first time. "I don't know what you're talking about," he mumbled. But his eyes told a different story. He knew. He had been caught. After the interview, Robert excused himself to the bathroom. What he didn't realize was that his microphone was still recording. As he paced the small restroom, talking to himself, his mind seemed to unravel. "What the hell did I do?" A pause. "Killed them all, of course." The words hung in the air, chilling and final. The entire world would hear them. And this time, there was no escaping. The room was empty. The cameras had stopped rolling. The interview was over. Or so Robert Durst thought. He shuffled toward the bathroom, muttering to himself. He had escaped justice for decades, dodged accusations, manipulated the truth. He had done this before. He could do it again. But this time, he had made a mistake. His microphone was still on, and it was recording everything. The words started slowly, fragments of thought spilling out as Durst paced. "There it is. You're caught." A pause, the sound of water running. "What the hell did I do?" He exhaled sharply, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Killed them all, of course." Silence. Just 6 words. 6 words that unraveled a lifetime of deception. The filmmakers listened in stunned horror. Had he just confessed? They replayed the tape over and over, analyzing every syllable. It wasn't just a slip of the tongue. It was the truth slipping out of a man who thought no one was listening. Word spread fast. When The Jinx aired its final episode in March 2015, millions of people heard Robert Durst's whispered confession. Social media exploded. News outlets ran headlines in bold black letters. Robert Durst caught on tape confessing to murder. It was the kind of evidence prosecutors had dreamed of for decades. But could a private, off-the-record comment hold up in court? Before The Jinx even finished airing, law enforcement was already moving. On March 14, 2015, the FBI found Robert Durst hiding in a New Orleans hotel. In his room, they discovered a fake ID, a map of Cuba, $42,000 in cash, a loaded .38 caliber revolver he was trying to run. But this time, there was nowhere left to go. Robert Durst was finally under arrest. And the confession caught on tape? It was about to become the centerpiece of the trial that would define his legacy. The courtroom was silent. Decades of evasion, deception, and unanswered questions had led to this moment. Robert Durst, now frail and confined to a wheelchair, sat emotionless as the judge prepared to read the verdict. This wasn't just another trial. It was a reckoning. The evidence was damning. The cadaver note, linking Durst directly to Susan Burman's murder. The hot mic confession, where he had whispered his darkest truth, killed them all, of course. The pattern of disappearance and death that had followed him for over 40 years. And now, the jury had made their decision. Robert Durst had spent a lifetime outmaneuvering law enforcement. Kathleen McCormack Durst had vanished in 1982, her body never found. Susan Burman was executed in her home in 2000, just before she could talk to investigators. Morris Black had been shot and dismembered in 2001, yet Durst had walked free. But now, his past had finally caught up with him. The judge took a breath. Robert Durst, on the charge of first-degree murder of Susan Burman. The courtroom held its breath. "We find the defendant guilty." Murmurs rippled through the room. Some gasped, others nodded in silent agreement. For Kathleen's family, it was the closest thing to justice they had ever received. For Susan's loved ones, it was long overdue. And for Robert Durst, it was the end of the road. On October 14, 2021, Robert Durst was sentenced to life in prison without parole. No more second chances, no more legal loopholes. But even then, he refused to break. "I did not kill my wife. I did not kill Susan. I did not kill anyone," he muttered in his raspy voice. Even after confessing on tape, even with overwhelming evidence against him, he still believed he could manipulate his way out of it. But this time, there was no escape. Robert Durst left the courtroom in handcuffs, wheeled away as cameras flashed. He had cheated justice for decades, but in the end, justice had won. And the world would never forget the twisted, chilling story of the man who almost got away with everything. Robert Durst spent his final days in a sterile prison hospital, far removed from the luxurious penthouses and grand estates he once called home. The man who had lived his entire life escaping consequences was now trapped, waiting for an end he could no longer manipulate his way out of. The walls around him were no longer those of high-rise apartments or secluded mansions. They were cold, unfeeling, and inescapable, just like the truth he had spent decades running from. By 2022, Durst's health had deteriorated rapidly. He was weak, frail, far from the cunning, elusive figure he once was. His once sharp and calculating mind was clouded with illness, but his arrogance never faded. Even after being sentenced to life in prison without parole, he still insisted that he was innocent. "I didn't kill anyone," he muttered in his raspy voice. But no one believed him anymore. The world had heard his own confession, captured on a hot mic. Killed them all, of course. Those words would follow him to his grave. Unlike the victims he had left behind, Kathleen McCormack Durst, Susan Burman, Morris Black, Robert Durst did not die in fear. He died comfortably, in a hospital bed, surrounded by guards instead of loved ones. There were no dramatic last words, no sudden confessions, no remorse. On January 10, 2022, Robert Durst took his final breath. There were no vigils, no mourning crowds, no one to grieve him. For the families of his victims, his death was not justice. It was an escape from the true punishment he deserved. Kathleen's body was still missing. Her family never got the answers they had spent 40 years searching for. Susan's execution had been covered up for decades. And Morris Black's murder? The trial had been a mockery of justice. Even in death, the full truth about Robert Durst remains a mystery. Where was Kathleen's body? What other secrets had he taken to his grave? Would justice have ever truly caught up to him? Some questions will never be answered. But one thing is certain, Robert Durst spent his life running. And in the end, death was the only thing that stopped him. What do you think of Robert Durst? Do you believe justice was truly served? Or are there still unanswered questions about Kathleen McCormack Durst's disappearance? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you love gripping true crime stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Subscribe now for more shocking real-life crime cases.